This is Learning Coherence, Chapter 7, a series on the architecture underneath professional learning plans. This chapter, Stakeholder Governance, and why naming the decision model before collecting feedback changes everything. Chapter 7, 3 layers, not 1 email. You've received this sentence. Thank you for your feedback. Based on your input, we have decided everything is implicit. Whose input? Which themes? What trade-offs? Why this decision and not another? The sentence asks you to trust that the connection between your input and the decision is real. You can't verify it. You can't trace it. You're asked to take it. And here's what I kept watching happen over time. Not dramatically. Not as a single moment of broken trust. Just a slow, steady decline. The people who show up for feedback sessions become the people who always show up. New voices stop. When you ask why, the answer is rarely, I don't trust you. It's more like, I don't think it matters. Not angry, not disengaged, just realistic about how the process has worked in the past. The question I kept sitting with was whether the connection between stakeholder input and organizational decisions could be made structural. A property of the system, where a teacher who submitted feedback can trace their own input from what they said, through how it was interpreted, to the decision that referenced it, not better communicated after the fact. Structural. That's the governance trace, and it has 3 layers. The first is evidence, what stakeholders actually said, captured in full, attributed, permanent, not summarized, not averaged, not reduced to themes before the original is even recorded. Every submission is a first-class record. A stakeholder can come back and verify that their input was captured accurately. The second is interpretation, the patterns that emerge across submissions. What themes converge? Where do people disagree? What ideas appear only once, but might be the most important thing anyone said? I enters this layer as a synthesis tool, not a decision maker. The mechanics of that boundary matter, and they're the next piece. The third is decision, what got adopted, what got declined, what got deferred, and the rationale for each. Not, we decided X, but we decided X, because these themes pointed in this direction, weighted against these tensions, and here's what we're deferring and why. 3 layers: evidence, interpretation, decision, each one visible, each one auditable, each one traceable to the layers above and below it. But before any of that matters, there's a structural move that has to happen first, and it's the one I think matters most, naming the decision model. Before any feedback is collected, the system requires the planning team to name how input will be used. There are 4 models. Inform. Stakeholders are told about a decision already made. Consult. Stakeholder input shapes the options, but the final decision rests with leadership. Co-decide. Stakeholders and leadership share decision authority. Delegate. Stakeholders make the decision. Each model is legitimate. Which one is appropriate depends on what's being decided, who has the relevant expertise, and what the organizational culture can support. There's no hierarchy. Inform isn't bad, and delegate isn't better. They're different tools for different governance situations. What matters is that the model is named before anyone writes a word of feedback. Because the pattern I kept watching wasn't organizations choosing the wrong model. It was the model not being named at all. Stakeholders submit input without knowing whether their voice is advisory, co-deciding, or being informed after the fact. And that ambiguity, which feels like flexibility in the moment, erodes trust over time. When a teacher is asked for feedback and doesn't know whether their input is advisory or decisional, they make an assumption. And when the decision doesn't match their assumption, the experience registers as, I wasn't heard, even when their input was carefully considered. The problem isn't the decision. The problem is the unstated expectation. Naming the decision model is being honest about the question before anyone engages with it. This is a consult. Your input shapes the options. Leadership decides. Here's why we chose this model for this decision. That transparency doesn't guarantee satisfaction with the outcome, but it establishes the terms. It tells stakeholders, here's exactly what role your voice plays, and here's what we commit to showing you about how your input was used. This is harder than it sounds. Naming the decision model requires leaders to say in advance who decides, and in many school cultures, that clarity feels risky. What if people want co-decide and you're offering consult? Those are real tensions. But the alternative, leaving it unnamed and managing the disappointment after the fact, is consistently worse. Unnamed models don't eliminate the tension. They defer it to a moment when trust is already on the line. And this is where the design work connects to something I care about beyond the technical architecture. Professional learning isn't done to teachers. It's done with them. And with has to mean something structural. If stakeholder feedback disappears into a process that can't show its own reasoning, then with is a word in a mission statement, not a property of the system. The three-layer architecture doesn't guarantee participatory governance, but it creates the conditions for it. What the institution does with those conditions is a cultural question, not a technical one. What the system produces, once the decision model is named and the feedback is collected, looks like this. The evidence layer holds every submission. The interpretation layer synthesizes it. The decision layer records what happened. And each layer is connected to the others. You can trace from decision back to interpretation, from interpretation back to evidence, from evidence back to the specific submission from the specific person. The structure is the promise. The mechanics are where the promise gets tested.